Hi, it's Robert Mendelson, Fractional CMO here in beautiful Montreal, welcoming you to another episode of the Fractional Pros Canada podcast. We're part of Fractional Pros Canada, the home for Canada's fractional community, and you can find us on Facebook. We bring you conversations about everything fractional that matters for fractional executives and businesses from coast to coast. Think of this as your go-to spot for real talk, practical wisdom, and strategies you can actually use, all without the corporate fluff and with plenty of Canadian content. Whether you're a fractional pro or a business in our great country of Canada and beyond, this conversation is for you. Grab your espresso and let's dive in. Welcome to the Fractional Pros Canada podcast. I'm your host and fractional CMO, Robert Mendelson, here in beautiful Montreal. And joining us today is a returning guest, dare I say, a returning favorite, James Winters. James is a seasoned fractional leader who isn't afraid to stir the pot in the fractional community. And if you've been in the Facebook group or on LinkedIn with the Fractional Pros Canada community, you know what I'm talking about, whether he's talking about the taboo of getting your hands dirty in execution as a fractional, or calling out agencies that are fumbling massive opportunities for their talent. Shots fired. We're going to get into that. This is going to be fun. Today's episode is sponsored by the fractionalproscanada.ca directory. Scaling a business in Canada is hard enough without the high price tag of a full-time C-suite hire. Most CEOs and founders I talk to need high-level strategy to break through, but they don't want the overhead, the long-term risk, or the 6-month recruiting cycle. So when they ask for a shortcut, I send them over to the Fractional Pros Canada directory. It's the curated hub for vetted high-tier fractional talent, experts who step in, find the gaps, deliver ROI from day one. Instead of digging through generic job boards, savvy leaders go where the specialists are already gathered. CEOs, founders, and business leaders, find your next strategic partner on the directory at fractionalproscanada.ca. James, welcome back to the pod.
Happy to be here.
So let's get right into this, James. So you recently started a debate about whether fractional leaders should do the actual work or just manage others, i.e., most fractionals at a fractional CMO, CTO, COO, etc. level are hired to and only really want to do the strategy. And we'll get into some reasons about that. And you said some people think it is wrong for an executive to do basic tasks before hiring a team. But many CEOs are tired of consultants, on the other hand, who only give advice and never help. You believe in doing the work yourself at the start. So tell us, how does doing the actual tasks early on help a company grow faster and make your plans more accurate as a fractional?
Yeah, I think the big thing here is accountability and visibility. Accountability in terms of how the work is being done, but ultimately why the work is being done, as to whether or not external forces are kind of pushing certain agendas forward in terms of tasks, campaigns, budgetary responsibilities, so on and so forth. And as you kind of are presented as a new leader or as a new entrant to that business, you have to understand how decisions are made and whether or not what's said in discovery and through the course of certain board meetings are actually being done executionally on the front lines of that business. So as someone who has to build a team, or better yet, has to delegate to a new team, how are those decisions made? And ultimately, whether or not those decisions lead to favorable outcomes, whether or not it's campaigns, whether or not it's new product rollouts, whether or not it is sales life cycles and forecasting. And all of these kind of go hand in hand in terms of direct line of sight, which is where I see a lot of new businesses, or better yet, stagnant businesses, have trouble pivoting because they no longer have line of sight from the C-suite directly to the executional layer, whether or not it's removing a VP layer or directorship layer to the front lines.
So isn't that more of a reporting problem, though? If the CEO has lost line of sight to what's actually happening, shouldn't they have some kind of, I always talk about as fractional CMO, show me your dashboard that you look at with your main, top KPIs that you're looking at that tells you what's going on. So you're suggesting that the only way for them to know what's going on is not just with a scoreboard, but actually being a little bit more involved, or having somebody that's like their own set of eyes, like you in this case, who's reporting back to them, hey, here's what I'm seeing?
Absolutely. So the big thing here is when it comes to dashboarding, everybody is reporting from a different source of truth in most cases, or that source of truth is ambiguous and doesn't really connect the dots in many cases to other parts of the business. So more often than not, that data is skewed. And ultimately, direct line of sight and direct transactional ownership for standard operating procedures and being able to rebuild those in a new business, or better yet, in a new contract, is something that ultimately will define your success. And what I've found is that in the process of developing better ways of doing things, you have to see how things are currently being done and what can be improved upon as you roll out new initiatives throughout that business, regardless of marketing, sales, product, or something else. And universally, those fractionals that I see that have been successful are those that at least roll their hands up in the early stages. They say, hey, listen, I want to get my hands dirty. I want to see how it's really being done. Don't sugarcoat anything. Let me just take the reins and do something positive about it. And those are the people that have longevity. Those are the people that get called in for complex cases. And those are the people that ultimately have greater success in fractional environments.
So you mentioned, I remember last time you were on the pod here, you mentioned that one of your secrets to success in business and in life is all about the data, having clean data. You were very specific about that. That's probably the main theme you talked about. It makes a lot of sense. So in this case, you're telling me that the problem with reporting is that often companies, everybody's pulling their data from different sources. So the KPIs, the dashboard is rendered pretty meaningless. Isn't it just a matter of fixing that problem? So everybody is reporting from the same sources of truth. So you get consistent reporting, and then that tells the story.
It's part of the answer. And I'd say the greater nuance is understanding where the data is coming from. And at a 30,000-foot view, for most C-suite, they really don't care, right? They're looking to paint a picture or a story that tells a certain narrative, whether or not it is for a funding milestone, whether or not it's for a business health check for board members and investors, or whether or not they're capable of expanding moving forward. And in order to get that data clean, dare I say, you have to do the work and see where the data is being funneled from and whether or not there is consensus across all parts of the organization, not just, let's say, sales or the CFO, to say that data is going to be our source of truth. And it takes a lot of massaging and it takes a lot of kind of effort to make that kind of schema work for the business, whether or not you're using a data lake that pulls in from multiple sources, whether or not you're using a visualization tool that can make sense of that data a little bit more contextually. So short answer is yes, it's part of the problem. And, it has to be part of a more contextual solution, if you will. But I don't think I've ever seen a business where I've come into that has that source of truth 100% clean, ever.
So walk us through what a typical engagement would look like for the ones where you're telling us that you start off by actually coming in, rolling up your sleeves and doing some of the execution work before you even get to the strategy. Have I got that right, first of all?
Partially. Normally we'll do strategy a little bit in the discovery phase, and we'll plot effectively what's referred to as a roadmap. Similar to how, let's say, for instance, a product roadmap scales out. Same thing for a fractional engagement roadmap as to how I would come in, assess where things currently are, plot where you would like to be, and then ultimately chart how we're going to get there, right? And that how you're going to get there is a reflection of your current states and processes, whether or not we can fix those things, and ultimately what is the internal and external uplift or capabilities that we need to get to that outcome that you want. And obviously, these are different for every business, right? The needs and effective outcomes that they're looking to achieve will be different, and they'll always be different.
So is the execution part that you're talking about, the rolling up your sleeves, is that kind of part of you doing discovery and understanding how things are working today, what that current state is, and going a layer or two below the C-suite level to really understand who's doing what, how they're doing it? Is that what you mean? Or are you actually, going together and going and putting together a marketing campaign, or, working on the SEO yourself? How granular do you get in the execution that you're doing?
And I hate to say it, it depends. In some cases, I'm brought in where a marketing team or a marketing leader has been removed. So I'm building processes from scratch. Sometimes I will go a little bit more granular, building marketing campaigns, nurture funnels, plugging in gaps where they exist. But for the most part, it is about seeing how things work within the business, whether or not, it is functional or dare I say dysfunctional. And ultimately, you see how those lines are crossed, whether or not there's redundancies or whether or not there are, shining stars in the rough who's just waiting for a chance to, show their stuff and kind of be a better partner to that business. And that comes with direct accountability and direct line of sight. You can't just let them be to their own devices, if you will. So that's kind of how I see it.
And you mentioned that for clients where you do more of the doing and not just the strategy, you tend to have more either repeat business from them or a longer term engagement with them. Talk to us about that.
Yes, this actually goes into the accountability part that I keep talking about, in that in the majority of these cases, a leadership team has had significant strife where they've had to make very serious decisions and they don't know who to trust. There's a whole bunch of contractors, consultants that will tell you everything under the sun. And few people are committed to an outcome, or better yet, will work hard enough to achieve that outcome. Not to say you have to kill yourself trying to, achieve something, but at the end of the day, you have to show that you're moving and trending in the right direction. And when I see consultants and even other practitioners go maybe 5 to 10% of expected outcome, that's a pretty big miss, right? And first and foremost, you have to see if that outcome is reasonable and attainable, right? It can't be a moonshot. But at the end of the day, if you're not getting like 80, 90, or even exceeding that outcome, that's a big problem. So that level of accountability, that level of respect, and not only that, reliability and resilience, something that's really kind of, dare I say, missing in the current state of, contractors right now. But it's something that really hits close to home, especially if you're working with a founder, especially if you're working with someone for whom this business is very personal.
So if I'm a CEO,
Mhm.
I totally get, the financial benefit and just the comfort level of hiring a fractional who's also going to do the work, or at least some of the work, compared to
Mhm.
somebody who just, as they say, writes a plan and expects others to finish it, finds other people to finish it, etc. But as a fractional, where is that risk of crossing the line to becoming a doer? And does that not diminish the credibility of a fractional who's been brought in to take their place as a fractional on the C-suite team? And other C-suite people sitting on the team are not doing execution. And now here comes this fractional dude who's actually sitting along them and is now a peer on the org chart, but is also below the org chart doing some other stuff. Doesn't that dilute your authority to some degree?
In some cases, yes. And it's more of a perception problem than it is kind of an operational problem. And I think the big thing here is the expectation. Set the expectation earlier on. I am doing this in the case of charting an SOP in terms of building a new function from scratch that makes sense for your business. Whether or not we need to rethink certain headcount, or whether or not we need to bring on new functions and capabilities of the organization. So, short answer here is yes, but you have to set a time and date when you're not going to be doing that executional work, when you're going to be building and delegating to that team to say, hey, listen, I plugged a gap, I solved for internal deficiencies or gaps in our capabilities to, let's say, for instance, do campaigns, to do partnerships, to do ad ops, whatever. And that said, yes, some people kind of look down on it. In fact, in some fractional CMO communities, they actually suggest that you're not supposed to be doing any executional work whatsoever. And I think you and I have had a debate about this as well. And yes, you can kind of maintain that position. But for me, based off of how many boomerangs I've got doing this, and kind of the sheer scale of revenue based off of what I'm no longer having to pitch for, it's quite stark, and it's, dramatic to see that increase. So I stand by it regardless.
So perception is reality, but managing expectations is gold, and that's kind of your secret to managing that additional functionality that you've added to what I'll call a pure fractional role of just offering strategy.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, I preach, I get a lot of fractionals asking me, I get a lot of people moving into the fractional space asking me, what do I do? What don't I do? And what I always say is the difference between a fractional and somebody who's a lower level consultant. And just to be clear, there are some fractionals in the Fractional Pros Canada community who go by the title of consultant. So it's a little bit ambiguous. At the end of the day, it's really a definition of what are you doing as a scope of work and not so much what your title is. So, but for somebody who is coming in and more as a strategic level advisor, thought leadership, putting together strategies versus somebody who is just working on SEO and paid campaigns, for example, that's where I draw the difference. That being said, I probably can't name you one fractional that I have spoken with, present company included, that has not crossed that line at some point and done some of the execution work. And I don't think it's a crime in any way. I just worry that it can dilute the authority that a C-suite level, fractional executive should have. So I like the way that you try to work around that by laying out the expectation. And also, I've had my own business. I know a lot of entrepreneurs who have businesses that are, in the 10 million plus level. And I speak to them regularly and they still tell me, somebody quit, I have to go do this, or the person I have in that position is not doing a good job. So I went and started doing it myself to see what was going wrong. Those kinds of instances make a lot of sense where you get your hands dirty to really understand what's going on. It's kind of similar to before I hand off a task to somebody else to do, I want to do it myself first to understand what's involved, what's the best way to do it, and understand also that it's going to be the right match of what needs to be done to the person that I'm going to be delegating it to. So from that perspective, I say it makes a lot of sense. I guess the nuance is doing the execution, so to speak, on a long-term basis versus doing it just at that beginning setup phase.
Yeah. And you hit the nail on the head earlier. I think the magic word here is authority, right? And a lot of consultants kind of make this mistake in terms of approaching fractional capabilities, that fractional has the responsibility, but the authority to carry out that responsibility, whereas a consultant does not. They have the responsibility and they have to kind of color within the lines of the SOW and kind of rules of engagement from their discovery process. And I've done both. There's nothing wrong. But at the end of the day, the decision-making capability and the authority to build and chart a new path, and yes, to own it, but yes, to control it as well. So that's always going to be the big thing, as far as I'm concerned.
So you shared a story about a company that lost a $540,000 deal because a hiring agency made mistakes. Tell us what happened there.
Absolutely. So there are different kind of pipeline capabilities that a fractional relies upon. The first one is always going to be a referral. You mentioned the directory earlier on. But as you go further down the list, there are a handful of kind of organizations and agencies that help you broker deals. The first is a fractional agency, the one that effectively manages a roster of globalized talent that has been pre-vetted. The next is a broker who takes a finder's fee right off the top. Maybe they're a partner, maybe they're a board member or some part of VC. And they'll probably bring you in for many complex cases. In fact, that's how I get a lot of my business at this point. And the others will be just kind of individual founders who are looking for talent and looking to plug gaps. So for this particular business, it was an actual fractional agency. And I approached this agency simply because I received a complex case for a major food manufacturer. And ultimately, agencies are supposed to manage talent, but also represent talent to make sure that business is secured by them and they are making consistent revenue off of it. So in this case, I had reached out to this organization. I gave them first pick. Um, Initially went through the submission process, but didn't hear back from anybody for about 2 or 3 weeks. And when you are looking at, fulfilling a role, you want to present talent as best and as quickly as possible. And it got to the point where once I kind of flagged it, it's like, hey, listen, we have a submission criteria period, and I have to get you in front of certain executives. Things actually did start to happen. And we had a very long back and forth, multiple threads, missed communication pieces, and everything that was in the brief was relatively consistent. There was no new information. So when I look at that, and if there are missed details, there are consistent kind of clarifications that, were already in the brief and that I have to really answer for, that's kind of a poor reflection on the organization at hand. And you have to see as to whether or not that is the kind of orientation to detail you can expect during the contract period or during the engagement period, and how that reflects on a potential contractor that they are representing. So it got to the point where, I had a very frank discussion with the founder, simply because we had previous engagements in the past. And, there were definitely some gaps there, definitely some misses. I'm not going to flame the organization. I've had pretty good relationships with the organization. But if anyone wants to ping me directly on the person who did this, we can definitely work on that.
So is this an indictment of fractional hiring agencies, or is this just a case of a business that's not being run very well?
It's a reflection of, how can I put this? Good help within your business, because the agency, there's nothing fundamentally wrong with them. I've worked with them in the past, and, one of the reasons why I decided to give this kind of juicy contract to them. And they were replacing someone who is on extended leave, and this person kind of dropped the ball in a series of capacities. So at the end of the day, everybody's going to have a bad day. But when you look at a consistent level of behavior and a consistent level of, details being missed, especially on a contract side of things, when you get further and further up in your practice, you can't make those kinds of mistakes, right? Especially if you're dealing with multi-million-dollar budgets, especially when you're dealing with big corporations. So at the end of the day, it's more of a representation issue and kind of a process issue as well. Personal opinion.
Well, always opinions expressed are not necessarily those of.
Exactly.
That's why we do this. So if I'm a CEO and I am looking to use an agency to hire a fractional, what are the warning signs I should look for that this agency is not a great agency? Obviously, time is obviously one of them if they're slow to react, but what else would be a flag that this agency is not doing the best job they could be?
Absolutely. So I'd say the big thing here is missing details. More often than not, you will get a brief from these organizations that are probably 10, 15 points. It will say expectations of credentials, of experience, of specific use cases that you will be instructed to follow through on that business or that contract. So if you're missing those details, or if you're getting them wrong consistently, that's going to be a big red flag. Second is lack of communication. If something is being brought up, more often than not, I'm super transparent. I will ask you right off the bat, how are you making your money? Are you taking 20% off the top? Are you doing a direct bill scenario? Are you taking a percentage of their bonuses? What? Simply because I want to manage that contractor relationship effectively once that person comes in. So understanding the financial details. And if they don't understand the financial details or they just kind of give you tidbits here and there, that's a big red flag. The third one is whether or not they are a consistent blocker to you and the candidate. And what I mean by that is many agencies create a profile. They don't give you a name, they don't give you anything else. And you don't actually meet that person until it's very late stage. And sometimes that's probably going to waste a lot of people's time, and you're going to end up with a non-fit before that person has to be presented to your executive team. So that's kind of the issues that I've run into, but other organizations who have solved those in advance have done much better. In fact, the one agency that I went through is a nice organization out of Texas, and they have a phenomenal team. They only get executives with long-term standing from Fortune 500 companies. And we went through the pay negotiation side of things very easily and upfront. We had direct communication with the candidate upfront, simply because they sourced two or three. And, some people said, hey, listen, the terms of the contract, they're a little too weird for me. It's a little too ambiguous or it's just a little too much. And that's fine. That's fantastic. Just let me know. Have that clear communication, be honest and transparent up front. And, things will work a lot smoother.
I wonder sometimes what the best resource is for a CEO, a founder to look for that next high level executive, C-suite executive. Because in my experience, at the end of the day, no matter how much background work and vetting, et cetera, an agency does, at the end of the day, where the rubber starts to hit the road is in that first meeting between whoever's doing the hiring, right at the top of the pyramid, the chart, and the person and the candidate. And up until then, the agency can say, oh, they've written all these tests and we've profiled them and we've checked the references. At the end of the day, that only goes so far. So I just always wonder, what is the best model that brings the most value? And all of agency recruiting comes at a big price tag, right? Usually it's a good percentage
Mhm.
of the first year's salary, et cetera, et cetera. At the end of the day, is it worth all that money versus somebody who, like the Fractional Pros Canada directory, we just connect people and that's it. And after that, you figure it out, so to speak. Now, that being said, we're vetting people before they appear on the directory, and they do have to pay to appear there, but we're vetting them before they can get on there and before we accept their money. And we go out to a CEO, a business leader, and say, here's our short list for you. We've checked them out. We know they're good fractionals, but the next step is really for you to start having that conversation. What are your thoughts?
You said it directly right there. You have to have a conversation. And sadly, I've worked with a lot of really good high performers, and it really depends on whether or not that person is in a state of mind ready to take on a contract of that type. Some people are having family issues, some people are traveling, some people are doing other things. You have to see whether or not they're in it and they're functionally capable of doing what you need at this point in time. And, especially when you deal with a lot of high performers, some are divas, but some are very kind of headstrong and they're doing their own thing. And is your contract going to take primacy over the next 6 to 12 months versus, whatever else they're working on? That's something that really has to be discussed, especially if you're dealing with contractors with mid to high level, um, dare I say, workloads, and whether or not they can commit and functionally be there for you as a good business partner. And, people change. Like I said, people have personal things going on in their lives, and you really have to kind of see whether or not that or those circumstances will be beneficial or a hindrance to that contract. And you only get there by starting that conversation. You can do all the checks in the world. Even more recently, for that big contract that we were discussing earlier, their initial hiring for that had significant checks and things like that, but they still missed a lot. And we ended up going through more deeper checks for those who have had errors and omissions claims on them, who have lost millions of dollars for their businesses. And, getting that level of access takes obviously a little bit more doing, but we did all of the due diligence in the front end. And then we started having conversations, but we reduced the conversation and the pitch window from 2 months to 3 weeks. And I think that level of, one, accountability, but two, just fundamental responsibility for that relationship, not to egg people on, not to string them along, but to have, mutual respect and make sure that they're going to be committed to you because you've stood up for them and obviously put money in their pockets, but you've managed a better relationship for that, doing the due diligence on the front end, but seeing where they are on the front end as well.
What do you say to CEOs who are of the mindset that I like the fractional idea, I like being able to hire a C-suite exec who is only going to work with me part of the time, cost me a lot less than a full-time, will be able to hit the ground running because they've already done this, they know what they're doing. But the thing that I don't like about the fractional thing is that I know that fractional also has other clients, and I don't want to have to compete with the fractional's other clients. What do you say to that? How do you respond to that objection?
That's a tough one. I've heard it before, definitely. And I hate to say it, the whole concept of being fractional is that you will have multiple clients. It is the primary definition, full
Right.
stop. And otherwise, you would need either an independent contractor or an individual contributor that is sole source. I will admit, I have seen sole source contractors of this type, but not in the fractional sense. So let's say, for instance, you are working in a restricted industry, let's say aerospace, defense. Obviously, there are secrets and IP that you have to maintain for a single source contract. The difference here is that they will pay for the rest of that time regardless. So they will pay well above market rate. So let's say, for instance, Lockheed Martin, if and when they do bring in fractionals, it's usually retooling, it's operations, and it's a few other things. And they will pay about double the market rate. So instead of having your 10 to 15,000, they're paying you about 30,000 a month, which is not bad for 20 hours a week. But that comes with strings attached, that comes with NDAs, that comes with sole source contracting, and ultimately you're at the beholden and their beck and call.
But you're getting paid for it.
Absolutely. So you're being compensated for that. So the CEO or founder who only wants sole source fractional, that's kind of an oxymoron. It doesn't exist.
Right. You might
Sorry, it just doesn't.
I want a fractional who can work for me full time. I think we call that a full time hire.
Exactly. And dare I say, like, there are definite shifts within the industry. Certain C-suite executives will probably not exist within 5 years, namely chief people and maybe even chief marketing. I am seeing marketing being nested under chief revenue for the most part, and also sales orgs are also being nested under chief revenue, whereas HR will go back to operations. And even then, the CFO will probably be fractional outright. Won't even, be full-time anymore just because of advances to where we are and how we process money, how we process utilities. So, personal opinion, that's where it is.
I tend to agree with you with that for that trend. I would take that bet and put my money on it as well. I think that's the direction things are going in for so many different reasons. One last bit I wanted to talk to you about, James. You mentioned that restructuring is about 80% of your business. And I'm curious, how did you get into that little subset of businesses where you're coming in, working with businesses that are restructuring, and how many of those are cases where you're replacing somebody else who was initially working in that role when they started the restructuring and things just were going sideways? They're like, we need James.
Absolutely. So this kind of goes back to earlier in my career. I was actually a consultant, white labeled behind Big Four. And what this actually started right before the 2008 crisis. So everybody's running around screaming, sky is falling, and businesses had to restructure very fast. Whether or not it's a debt crisis, whether or not they're operationally offside, whether or not this was kind of like the, dare I say, mid part of globalization. Like 2006 was a big deal. And then 2 years later, manufacturing just went away from North America. So that's kind of where I got my start in terms of rebuilding and restructuring businesses here at home that did not have the wherewithal to pivot or the capability to understand how they need to present their businesses moving forward. So I was brought in by a bunch of people, and I come in where, armchair MBAs and big consultants fail, just because I've always had that kind of mentality and um, that kind of accountability to do the work. So you're looking at financial reports, you're looking at personnel, you're looking at operations expenses, and ultimately building new teams to support the new functions for that business. So here we are, 20 years later, back in the same kind of thing, but the impetus is very different. It's AI, it's, wartime, it's an oil crisis, whatever else. And people, once again, have been complacent within those businesses and they are restructuring en masse. So, to the second part of your question, in terms of coming in where another person was already there, in one of the businesses I was working within, the big business, in fact, that CPG business we were talking about earlier for that big contract, they initially had their own personal hires. All of them did not hit any of the stated outcomes. They brought in a big four consultants. They hit 10% of stated outcomes, but ultimately wasted hundreds of thousands of dollars. So I got in third kick in the can, and we're hitting roughly 90 to 95% of stated outcomes. So we're coming close. And quite frankly, by end of year, we'll exceed those outcomes or stated outcomes. So I will boomerang back into that business by end of year. So at the end of the day, understanding where people have done well, where people have not done so well, and picking up the pieces is really kind of reflective of being nimble in those environments. And you really have to live it and breathe it to do it well. And you have to stand by an outcome.
What's your experience been when you're restructuring teams and you're recycling existing team members that they're now breaking up and putting into different teams, taking the same talent and moving them to kind of like right person, wrong seat to right person, right seat versus wrong person, wrong seat, and they just have no place in the organization? How often are you able to find a new and better home for the existing talent versus having to show them the door?
Absolutely. So this is a really big thing because I worked agency for so long and even like big four consultancy behind the scenes. More often than not, well above 90%, I can actually restructure into a different team. And I think the big thing here, once again, is having a conversation. Where are you as a person? What do you want out of this role? What do you want to achieve 2, 3, 5 years? And obviously, they're going to lie to you in the beginning until they have a more kind of authentic relationship and authentic line of sight. And for bigger teams, I'll admit you can't do that. Anything above like 30, 40 people is just way too much. But if you're having a small team, 5, 10, even up to 20 people, you can do those things individually. And, some people really want to, start their own business. They want to get involved with certain kind of technology life cycles. They want to do different things within the concept of the role. And more often than not, I can provide those things. However, there are the wild cards who just say, listen, I'm just here for the money. Like, I just need to pay my bills, man. Like, what else am I going to do? And those are the serious ones because on one hand, yes, the passion isn't there, but you have to reignite that passion and you have to see what makes them tick, whether or not they feel like they're not winning, whether or not maybe they need a better path within the organization, or sometimes you have to cycle them out. And, that's a really tough conversation. But in most cases, I can find people a better path, or I can connect them to resources necessary to help kind of propel them forward. And it's funny you mentioned that because out of all of the direct reports that I've had, all but like 5 or 6 are actually multimillionaires at this point. Some started their own agencies, some paint, some travel the world, some just do their own thing. And you have to build up a certain kind of catchment of either financial capability or sustainability to get beyond just the job. And sometimes I tell people, hey, listen, fund your skills base and fund your functional priority or capabilities first, and then achieve your dreams, or better yet, save the whales or do whatever else. So you got to get to a certain point in your life to create that impetus for change. And I think for many of us fractionals, this has provided us, control, a little bit more authority within our catchment, our capabilities, but also the rewards of functional impact, right? And I think the ability to have impact speaks a lot more. And you'll see that even for ICs, they want to see that their work matters, that they have impact within the business. And ultimately they have to be excited for it. If they're not going to be excited for it, you can't, push them to it, but they have to feel ownership and they have to feel the responsibility for that.
Yeah, well said. Good advice for not just people in the workplace, but I think life in general. It's that, make sure I get this right. Work to live, not live to work.
That's exactly it.
Yeah.
And I think even now where, financial pressures are really big, people genuinely feel like, what's next? Do I leave my community? Do I leave my country? Do I do something else? And this is very common with high performers who think or who are very hard on themselves. So they're overthinking. Prime example, I had 2 friends, Bay Street lawyers, making like $500,000 each apiece. And they got to a point during COVID and they just said, I've had enough. They moved to Northern Ontario. They bake bread and they're making about the same amount of money now with their small bakery. So at the end of the day, they're, much more fulfilled. They're doing their own thing. And it could be a very different path. You just have to have the stability enough to pursue that path and to lift your head up just a little bit.
I guess the takeaway from that is whether you're working on Bay Street or baking bread, you can still be rolling in the dough.
Oh yeah, pun intended.
Couldn't resist. All right, James, you've been on here before, so you know what the last question is. If you could put a message on a billboard for every fractional and CEO and business leader to see as they drive by it every day on the highway of life, what would you be putting on that billboard message today?
Yeah, right now, be true to yourself and, play to your superpower. And I think it's a variation of the last time.
You'll have to go back and look up what you said last time. I didn't check. Actually, I intentionally did that because if you would have said the same thing, I didn't want to call you out on it. So there you go. I was being
fair
nice.
Enough.
James, thank you so much once again for coming on the Fractional Pros Canada podcast and sharing with us.
Absolutely happy to be here. Thanks again, Robert.
That's a wrap on another episode of the Fractional Pros Canada podcast. If you're a fractional professional based in Canada, we'd love to have you join us in the Fractional Pros Canada Facebook group, the home for Canada's fractional community. It's where Canadian fractional executives connect, share insights, and help each other succeed. Until next time, I'm Robert Mendelson, Fractional CMO. May your impact be full-time, even if your hours are fractional.